A sheriff haunted by ghosts of the past found a pregnant woman near death in a relentless blizzard. As he took her in, he didn't imagine he was sheltering a dangerous secret that would bring the fury of cruel men to his door. Fate intertwined their lives brutally, and the price of protection could be his own soul. Prepare yourself, for this is a story of redemption and unlikely love that will grip you. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. As dawn broke, when the wind still whispered icy secrets over the highest peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the blizzard was already showing signs of truce. The world, previously a furious white blur, began to define itself in soft contours, like a charcoal drawing slowly being revealed. It was in this setting of austere beauty and recent danger that Sheriff John Miller followed a nearly invisible trail in the deep snow. The wail that had guided him the previous night wasn't from a wolf, nor the whistling of the wind in the canyons. It was a human lament, thin and desperate, a thread of agony that stood out from the wild symphony of the storm. He found her huddled against a dark rock, a figure almost swallowed by the snow, her prominent belly an incongruous shape beneath layers of torn and soaked fabric. When her eyes opened, fixing on his, they were like wells of ancient terror, an exhaustion that seemed to have drained the very essence of life. John, a man whose soul seemed as eroded as the ravines he had patrolled for years, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something in those eyes, a depth of suffering that echoed the deepest ravines of his own existence. With the stubbornness of someone who has nothing left to lose and, precisely for that reason, clings to duty like a shipwrecked man to wreckage, he wrapped her in his heavy sheepskin coat and, with effort, lifted her into his arms. Her weight was almost insignificant, as if she were made of bird bones and fear. The sheriff's cabin was a few miles from the nameless town, a dusty cluster of poorly nailed boards and even more fragile hopes. It was his refuge and his prison, a place where the silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth or the distant howl of coyotes. The town itself was little more than a stagecoach stop, a blur in the vastness for the trains that cut across the distant plains with their arrogant smoke. The air there smelled of old dust, sweaty horses, and on Saturday nights, cheap whiskey and old gunpowder, remnants of forgotten altercations. John, with his 40 years etched on his face like plow furrows in dry land, was a figure of reluctant authority. His eyes, a faded blue like the midday summer sky, were relentless observers. They saw everything, registered every detail, but his lips rarely moved to comment. He carried the weight of a personal tragedy, the loss of his wife, Martha, and little Sarah, taken by a merciless fever years before. That loss had sealed him off from the world, transforming him into a shell of a man, functional but hollow inside. His fierce loyalty to the unwritten code of the West, protect the defenseless, maintain order, even if it was a precarious order, was what drove him, although he did it with a cold, almost mechanical resignation. His internal conflict was a blind knot of guilt, the persistent feeling that he had failed to protect those he loved most, a failure that he had internalized as a fundamental inability to love, to care, to keep safe. The presence of the unknown woman, now feverish and delirious in his makeshift bed near the fireplace, was like a needle stirring in his barely healed wound. He covered her with another blanket. Her breathing was shallow, her dry lips murmuring incomprehensible words. The sheriff's solitude was a heavy coat, stitched with the threads of loss and regret, which he wore even under the most inclement sun. And now, this new presence, so fragile and needy, threatened to undo some of those painful seams. The snow melted as quickly as it arrived, as if spring, impatient, had swept winter away with an abrupt gesture. It revealed a washed world but still arid, the brown and gray earth sprinkled with the timid green of new vegetation. The first weeks in the cabin were a tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the creak of the floorboards under John's boots, and the occasional murmurs of the woman as she fought the fever. He fed her thin broth, wiped her sweaty forehead with a damp cloth, all with a distant, almost professional efficiency. It was care devoid of warmth, but not of dedication. He was fulfilling a duty, nothing more. At least that's what he told himself. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, began to improve slowly. The fever subsided, and consciousness returned to her eyes, although they still carried the shadow of fear. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with hair dark as night and fine features that exhaustion and suffering could not completely erase. Her name, she whispered one day, her voice still weak, was Clara. She offered no last name, no story, and John didn't ask. He had learned long ago that some questions were doors that, once opened, could reveal more pain than a man could bear. The town, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding in the isolated cabin, continued its sleepy routine. Old Mr. Peterson's saloon opened at noon and closed when the last drunk stumbled out. Mrs. Johnson's general store, a stoic widow with kind eyes, sold everything from flour and beans to ammunition and ribbon bows. The blacksmith, a corpulent German named Mr. I. Miller, made the air ring with the sound of his hammer on the anvil. John went to town every few days to get supplies and maintain the appearance of normality. No one asked about his movements, and he offered no explanations. His isolation was respected, or perhaps feared, but curious eyes followed him, especially those of Mrs. Johnson, who always offered him a cup of hot coffee and pleasant conversation. Gentle attempts to break his shell. He appreciated the gesture, but rarely accepted it completely. Clara began to move around the cabin, initially with the hesitation of a wounded animal. Her eyes followed John with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He noticed how she flinched slightly when he approached suddenly, how her hands trembled holding the mug of broth. Someone had hurt her, and badly. One day he was mending one of his worn boots, the sole almost detached. He did it in silence, concentrated, his large, rough hands surprisingly agile with the needle and thick thread. She watched him from the chair near the fireplace, a blanket over her knees despite the growing spring warmth. When he finished, he handed her the boot. Their fingers brushed for an instant. A minimal contact, but one that seemed to carry a subtle electric current. She murmured a "thank you," her voice still a little hoarse. He just nodded, but felt a strange warmth spread in his chest, a feeling he didn't recognize or perhaps had forgotten long ago. It was the first link, fragile as spiderweb, between two damaged souls. Weeks turned into a month, and Clara's presence in the cabin became a strangely comfortable routine for John. She began to help with small tasks, folding blankets, trying to sweep the floor with a makeshift broom, although he insisted she rest. Her belly grew noticeably, a constant reminder of the new life she carried and the danger that seemed to hover over her like a dark cloud. The truth about Clara's past was a shadow that crept through the corners of the cabin, growing every day, threatening to swallow the fragile light of hope that was beginning to emerge between them. He found himself watching her when she thought he wasn't looking, the way the afternoon sunlight highlighted the coppery strands in her dark hair, the persistent sadness in her eyes, even when a rare smile touched her lips. He began to talk more, not much, but enough to break the oppressive silence. He told her about the town, about the mountains, about the animals that sometimes approached the cabin. She listened attentively, asking occasional questions, her voice gaining strength every day. Then they arrived. 3 men on horseback emerging from the dust of the road like dark apparitions. They rode into the nameless town with the arrogance of men who felt they owned the place. They were different from the usual prospectors or cowboys. Their clothes were dark and well cut, although dusty from the journey. Their weapons, 2 revolvers each, hung low and ready in worked holsters. Their faces were hard, marked by the sun and by cruelty, and their eyes swept everything with a predatory intensity. John was leaving Mrs. Johnson's store when he saw them dismount in front of the saloon. A shiver ran down his spine. He knew that type of man. They were hunters, and they weren't there by chance. The small town, a cornered animal, shrank under the predatory gaze of the newcomers, and the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an unspoken threat. John felt the knot in his stomach tightened. They couldn't be there for any other reason. They were looking for her. The first moment of high tension had arrived, silent and relentless as a snake in the tall grass. The 3 men, led by a tall, lean type with a scar that pulled his lip into a permanent, sinister smile, named Butch, began asking discreet but sharp questions in the saloon, the stable, the general store. They were looking for a woman, pregnant, with dark hair. They offered a generous reward for information. The news spread through the small town like wildfire through dry straw. John watched from a distance, his face an impassive mask, but inside, his instincts screamed danger. He knew it was only a matter of time until someone, out of greed or fear, mentioned the woman the sheriff had rescued from the blizzard. He needed to buy time, needed to know more about those men and who had sent them. He returned to the cabin with a heavy heart. He found Clara sitting at the rough table, trying to mend one of her few pieces of clothing with thread and needle he had brought her from town. She looked up when he entered, and a small smile lit up her face. A smile that quickly faded when she saw his grim expression. "What happened, John?" she asked, her voice suddenly apprehensive. He hesitated for a moment, then told her about the men in town. He saw the terror return to her eyes, the color drain from her face. She dropped her sewing, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "They found me," she whispered, her voice choked. "He sent them." "Who, Clara?" John asked, his voice soft but firm. That night, by the fireplace, with the wind howling outside like a premonition of what was to come, Clara finally told part of her story. She spoke of a powerful and cruel man, a cattle baron from a distant territory named Silas Blackwood, a man she had been promised to against her will, a man who saw her as property, not a person. She had fled the night she discovered she was pregnant, knowing he would never let her go, especially carrying his heir. She didn't go into detail about his cruelty, but the way her body trembled and the silent tears that streamed down her face as she spoke said more than words. John listened in silence, his face hardened by the rage that grew within him. A cold, calculating rage. He felt the weight of his responsibility increase. It was no longer just an impersonal duty. It had become something more. He looked at Clara, at her vulnerability, at the life she carried, and knew he would do anything to protect them. When she finished speaking, a heavy silence hung between them. Then she took a small silver locket from her neck, simple and a little dented. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice low. "It's the only thing of value I have. I want you to have it. For everything." John looked at the locket in her palm. It was warm to the touch. He hesitated, then closed her fingers over the object. "Keep it, Clara. You'll need it to give to your child." But her gesture, the implicit trust, opened another small crack in his armor. He took a small pocket knife he always carried, one that had belonged to his father, and began carving a small bird in a piece of wood he had taken from the firewood box. He worked in silence for a while, and when he finished, he handed the small wooden bird to her. "For the baby," he said awkwardly. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was a different shine in them. She held the bird as if it were a treasure. It was a silent exchange, a recognition of a bond that was strengthening. In the following days, John prepared for the inevitable. He checked his weapons, stocked ammunition. He reinforced the cabin door and window shutters. He knew his small fortress wouldn't withstand a determined attack, but it would give them a chance to fight. The tension in town was palpable. Blackwood's men grew more impatient, their presence more oppressive. John confronted them once, in the middle of the main street, his voice calm but his eyes cold as ice. "This town is under my protection," he said. "If you're looking for trouble, you found the wrong place." The leader, the man with the scar named Butch, just smiled his sinister smile. "We don't want trouble, Sheriff, we just want what's ours." "People don't belong to anyone," John replied, before turning and walking away, leaving them with the implicit threat. The discovery came treacherously. An old prospector, alcoholic and desperate for a few bucks for whiskey, saw John buying more supplies than usual at Mrs. Johnson's store, including some clearly feminine items. He put the pieces together and, motivated by the promise of reward, sought out Butch and his men. On a dark, moonless night, as a storm gathered in the mountains, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and ozone, John was outside the cabin, checking the surroundings. His senses were sharp, every sound from the forest amplified by anticipation. It was then that he saw a fresh track in the mud near the creek, too large for an animal, and it wasn't his. And then, further on, an almost extinguished cigarette, the same brand Butch smoked. They knew. They had found the cabin. The second moment of high tension arrived like a punch in the gut. The circle was closing. John's breath caught in his throat. Time was up. He entered the cabin quickly, his face pale under his tan. Clara, who was dozing in a chair, woke up startled by his abrupt entry. "They know where we are," he said, his voice tense. "We have to prepare." The fear in her eyes was overwhelming, but there was also a new determination. She stood up, her hand protectively on her belly. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm. As they barricaded the door and windows, the conversation between them became more intimate, more desperate. "I lost my wife and my daughter, Sarah Clara," John said, his voice rough with an old pain he rarely let show. "I wasn't there to protect them. I can't fail again." Her eyes filled with compassion. "You won't, John, and I'm so scared. Not for me, but for this child. She's all the hope I have left." He held her hand for a moment, a gesture of comfort and promise. "We'll protect her, together." The shared vulnerability in that dark hour forged a bond between them stronger than steel. The storm broke with fury, the rain lashing the cabin, the wind howling like a choir of lost souls. And then, amidst the roar of nature, came the sounds they feared. The pounding of horses' hooves, Butch's hoarse shout. "Sheriff, we know she's in there. Hand her over and nobody else gets hurt." John gripped his Winchester rifle, the barrel cold and familiar in his hands. "Stay away from the window, Clara," he ordered, positioning himself near a crack in the shutter. The night exploded in fury, spitting fire and lead, as the cabin groaned under the assault like a ship in a storm. The bandits' shots splintered the wood, the deafening sound mixing with the thunder. John returned fire with calculated precision, each bullet fired with a purpose. He saw one of Butch's men fall from his horse, then another retreat screaming in pain. But there were three of them, and he was only one. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Clara let out a sharp moan. John turned and saw her doubled over, her face contorted in pain. "The baby. It's coming," she managed to say between gasps. Panic threatened to swallow John. Protect Clara, fight the bandits, and now, help with a childbirth during a shootout. It seemed impossible, but he looked at her face, at the trust mixed with fear, and knew he couldn't falter. He helped her lie down on the makeshift bed, away from the wall that was taking most of the shots. Between shots, he tried to calm her, following vague memories of what his mother had told him about childbirth. The fight outside continued. Butch, enraged by the resistance, shouted threats and obscenities. John knew they would try to break in. He needed to end it, and fast. In a moment of relative calm in the shooting as he reloaded his rifle, Clara, even in the midst of a painful contraction, saw a figure sneaking along the side of the cabin, towards the back window, which was less protected. "John, look out! Behind you!" she shouted, her voice tense with effort and alarm. He turned in time to see one of Butch's men trying to force the shutter. A quick, accurate shot from the sheriff made him retreat with a howl. Clara's warning, her act of courage in the midst of her own agony, had saved his life. It was a silent sacrifice, a demonstration that they were truly together in that fight. Butch, now alone but even more dangerous in his desperation, tried one last card. With a wild yell, he ran towards the door, shooting wildly, trying to break it down with his shoulder. John knew the door wouldn't last long. He had to face him. "Stay here, Clara," he shouted, and ran to the door. The moment Butch managed to open a crack, John kicked the door hard, throwing the bandit back into the mud. He stepped out into the storm, his revolver drawn, facing Butch under the pouring rain and the lightning that lit the scene like ghostly flashes. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Shots echoed in the night, the smell of gunpowder mixing with that of the wet earth. John felt a sharp pain in his arm. A bullet from Butch had grazed him, but his own shot was accurate. Butch fell to his knees, the sinister smile finally erased from his face, before tumbling forward, lifeless. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the shootout. broken only by the sound of the rain and Clara's distant groan coming from inside the cabin. John ran back inside, his arm bleeding, his heart pounding wildly. He found Clara exhausted, but her eyes shone with incredible strength. With his clumsy help between pains and pushes, under the flickering light of an oil lamp, a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. The strong, healthy cry of a baby, a girl. John, his hands still trembling from the battle and now dirty from childbirth, cut the umbilical cord with his pocket knife and wrapped the small creature in a clean cloth. When he placed her in Clara's arms, he saw a kind of peace on her face he had never seen before. A peace that seemed to radiate and touch something deep inside him. He sat beside the bed, exhausted, wounded, but with a strange feeling of contentment. Fear was a hungry animal gnawing at his insides during the confrontation, but the determination to protect Clara and the child was the whip that kept it at bay. And now, with the battle won and the new life in their arms, that fear began to recede, replaced by something warmer, more luminous. The calm after the storm, however, was brief. Clara developed a high fever the next morning, a complication of the difficult birth and stress. John, caring for his own arm wound, felt an icy terror run through his body. The idea of losing her, now that she and the baby had become the center of his world, was unbearable. He cared for her with fierce dedication, applying cold compresses, forcing her to drink water and herbal teas he remembered his grandmother preparing. At the same time, news of the shootout at the sheriff's cabin and the deaths of Blackwood's men spread through the town. Some looked at John with renewed respect, others with fear. Mrs. Johnson was the first to offer help, bringing food, clean clothes for the baby, and a worried look for Clara. While Clara fought the fever, a new rumor began to circulate, brought by a traveler who had passed through Silas Blackwood's territory. The cattle baron himself, upon learning of his men's deaths, was reportedly coming personally with an even larger group to reclaim his property and avenge his henchmen. The third moment of high tension set in, a dark threat on the horizon, breaking the fragile sense of safety they had achieved. But Clara was strong. The fever subsided after a few agonizing days, and she began to recover slowly, nourished by John's care and the constant presence of her daughter, whom she named Emily. Hope, a name that seemed like a lighthouse in the darkness. John and Clara cared for little Emily together. He awkward at first, learning to change makeshift diapers and calm the baby's crying with a surprisingly soft voice. The cabin, previously a sanctuary of solitude and pain, filled with new sounds, new smells, a new life. The dynamic between them changed subtly. Looks were longer, smiles more frequent. The intimacy forged in danger and in the child's birth created a deep and undeniable bond. John found himself smiling for no reason, feeling a warmth in his chest that he thought had died with Martha and Sarah. Guilt was still there, a lingering shadow. But now there was something more, something that pushed it into the corners. When Clara was strong enough, she finally told John the whole truth about Silas Blackwood. He wasn't just cruel. He was a sadistic monster, obsessed with control, whose influence stretched over vast territories. Her escape had been an act of extreme desperation. "He'll never stop looking for me, John," she said, her voice choked with fear, especially now that he knows about Emily. John held her hand. "We'll face him, Clara. If he comes, we'll be ready." But he knew they couldn't live forever under that threat. The town, initially fearful of Blackwood's wrath, began to unite around their sheriff. John's courage and Clara and Emily's story touched something in them. Mrs. Johnson organized the inhabitants, and they offered help, vigilance, and even men willing to fight if necessary. John, for the first time in years, didn't feel completely alone. Blackwood's threat, however, never materialized in the way they feared. Weeks passed, and the only news that arrived was that the cattle baron, upon learning that he would have to face not only a determined sheriff, but an entire united town, and perhaps fearing the attention that an open conflict would draw to his other shady businesses, had decided for now to retreat. Perhaps he had other problems, other properties to control. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the story of the resistance in the nameless town had become a warning. The shadow of Blackwood still hovered, but it was no longer an immediate and crushing threat. The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with possible futures, like the land after a redemptive rain, awaiting the right seeds to flourish. With the threat diminished, a new question arose. What to do now? Clara couldn't return to her past, and John didn't want to return to his solitude. On a sunny afternoon, while they watched little Emily sleep serenely in a makeshift crib he himself had built, Clara turned to John, her eyes full of an emotion he was beginning to recognize as love. "I have nowhere else to go, John," she said softly. "But, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm home." He looked at her, at the strength and beauty that radiated from her, at the small child who represented a new beginning. The pain of losing Martha and Sarah would never completely disappear, but he realized that his heart, which he thought was irremediably broken, was still capable of loving, capable of protecting, capable of feeling joy. Hope, previously a seed forgotten in arid soil, began to sprout in his heart, watered by Clara's presence and the strong cry of the newborn, promising a harvest of meaning in his devastated life. "Then stay, Clara," he said, his voice choked. "Both of you. This cabin is small, but there's enough room for a family." A radiant smile lit up Clara's face, and she leaned in and kissed him, a soft kiss, full of promises and gratitude. The nameless town, which before seemed just a forgotten stop in time, began to change too. The courage of their sheriff and the story of Clara and Emily injected new life into the community. People seemed to walk a little straighter, smile a little more. John Miller, the sheriff with the eroded soul, found not only redemption for his past, but a future he had never dared imagine. He continued to be a man of few words, but his eyes were no longer so haunted. There was a new light in them, a reflection of the love and hope that now filled his life. He had learned that protecting the defenseless was not just a duty, but an act of love, and that, even in the deepest ravines of the soul, life, and love, always find a way to flourish. The cabin in the mountains, previously a symbol of isolation, became a home, warmed not only by the fireplace, but by the laughter of a child, and the silent love between a man who thought he had lost everything and a woman who had found everything when she least expected it. And so, under the vast sky of the West, among towering mountains and windswept plains, a new story began to be written, a story of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of the human heart.